glad to be back, and I'm glad that you're here with me again. Since this is the last lecture in this series, I think it's important to understand that this is part of a project which I've been working on and writing on, and I think it's important for you to realize that there are names and possibly images that you'll have seen before, some, and then of course there'll be new ones, and they'll be put into different contexts. This is important because when we speak of Costa, Spinoza, Herzl, we're speaking of historical figures that actually existed. Maybe not, especially Costa, not a name which is very common. Spinoza and Herzl are much better known. But I want to put this into a context coming from my perspective as a historian who's concerned with visual material that can add an element of importance to the study of the past. And I emphasize this because as more and more people, when they make presentations on any topic, are using PowerPoint, and they're bringing a large number of images, I think it's important for people to remember that these images, something has to be said about these images, and in some way also connected to the text that they're interested in. And so this evening, I'm going to begin by saying something about this problematic of historical paintings. I'm sure that many of you, when you go to a museum and you see historical paintings, you're saying, this isn't very interesting. And they're often, the historical paintings are relegated to insignificant corners in a museum and possibly are not even shown. Though they figured prominently in the 19th and 20th century, less so today, to highlight a particular theme in the national revival of people's cultures and countries. Now let's think about this for a minute. That is, sometimes when a culture is trying to revive itself, a nation is trying to bring together its past, they will often find that the artists coming from that culture will go back in time, and they will imagine how a certain event took place. And therefore, dramatic events of the past, unfortunately, often acts of war, were central topics for artists. And they, in a sense, succeeded to capture or to relive a moment and invest it with special meaning. And therefore, one can say that the artists are condensing a sequence of events into one frame. The artist is doing this sometimes because he or she was commissioned to do so, or voluntarily was inspired to do it, and in a sense created the illusion that the historical development could be encapsulated into this one painting. In other words, we're not speaking about a video, we're not speaking about the ability of the artist to show 5, 6, 7 works, but in one painting to try to bring together issues which were central in terms of that period. Just for a moment, try to hopefully remember the two paintings that I showed you 3 weeks ago when you looked at Mendelssohn. And you saw there what, first of all, Moritz Oppenheim had created the painting with Mendelssohn and Lafayette and Lessing in the background. And then several years later, another artist, Katzenstein, changes somewhat the situation, but he's using the same figures. So, in a sense, when I'm going to be talking about today, about Costa, Spinoza, Jesus, Herzl, and how artists of Jewish origin depict them, we have to keep this in mind. Works of art reappear in a wide range of memorabilia, and sometimes they help shape the historical memory or imagination of the event, giving certain evidence to an observation made by a very important figure of the 20th century, Walter Benjamin, on the impact of mass production and mass reproduction in the last 2 centuries. And I want you to keep in mind something. When you're, hopefully, if I get to the end of this lecture, if you will see some of the images that I'm going to show you of Herzl, you will be, if you haven't seen them before, you'll be shocked. But I'm not bringing them to shock you. I will be bringing them for you to understand that a certain period of time, an artist who was coming from certain disciplines of artistic creation is thinking of a way to create something of the past. Now, this was very common among French artists, Spanish artists, German artists, and so on and so forth. In other words, there was visual creativity which they were common to, and they wanted to strengthen the image of a sentiment or an ideology, either asked them by a patron or which they themselves wanted to produce. Now, that form of visual creativity was relatively absent from the sphere of European Jewry until the modern period. And among Jews from the Islamic world, it's almost completely was uncommon. And so what I've been trying to express to you over these 3 weeks was the way in which in modern Jewish life the past is taking a new form of communication, especially from the end of the 18th century. The emergence of artists of Jewish origin, and I go back to this notion, artists of Jewish origin, not necessarily Jewish artists, who, unlike their predecessors in early periods, they attempted to leave their mark on the general cultural scene. They had studied at academies of art. They came under influence of different styles, and yet they turned at times to contemporary Jewish figures. At times, they turned to historical figures for their own personal and public agenda. They are attracted to these figures for a range of different concerns. Internal anxieties, aspirations, while favoring in general. And that, I would say, is probably true for all of the figures, all of the artists we're going to see in this presentation. They're all involved in some form of acculturation. None of them continue to be part of a traditional Jewish society. Now, we have seen how people represented Mendelssohn. We have seen in the previous lecture how some people dealt with, especially Hirschenberg, how he dealt with Spinoza, and how Gottlieb dealt with Spinoza and da Costa. And of course, in the 19th century, another figure who is extremely important was Moses Montefiore, and we saw Montefiore in some of the images, if you remember, done by Israel Wiese. And the figure who will be very important for 20th century art by artists of Jewish origin and by Jewish artists is the figure, of course, of Theodor Herzl, whose image continues to be a source of endless replicas in many, many different contexts. And those of you who have ever looked at the Knesset, the parliament in Jerusalem, you will see on the back of the speaker, there's a picture of Herzl. And interestingly enough, in a country which always has endless controversies about everything, I don't know that there's ever been a controversy about the fact that there's this one picture, as if he is the icon of Israel. Now, Herzl will be discussed later on in this lecture, which will begin by discussing two Amsterdam Jews, Uriel de Costa and Benedictus Spinoza, and it will also deal with Jesus at some point, and Benjamin and Theodor Herzl. De Costa and Spinoza emerged in the artistic imagination as the cultural vision that heralded acculturation in opposition to the rabbinic authority. Their images were appropriated. Now, just think about this for a moment. Their images were appropriated as exemplars of non-traditional forms of expression and as representatives of alternative directions in Jewish life. Jewish artists in the 19th century became involved in the historical reconstruction of a Jewish pedigree. And the case of Amsterdam Jewry of the 16th and 17th century and its two most well-known counter-heroes offered them a fascinating opportunity to interpret the past imaginatively. And let me say something about these two figures. Both de Costa and Spinoza went against the grain of traditional Jewish society. They battled basic Jewish belief systems, and they brushed against the oligarchy of the Amsterdam rabbis. They were both excommunicated. De Costa, who died in 1640, and Spinoza, who was excommunicated in 1656 by the Mahamad for what were considered heretical beliefs. De Costa committed suicide in 1640, seemingly unable to overcome the sense of humiliation he was forced to undergo and the degrading ritual to annul the second excommunication. De Costa leaves behind a scathing autobiographical text in Latin called the Exemplar of a Human Life, which fulminated against the rabbinic authorities for crucifying him, intimating a sense of his identification with the fate of Jesus. So both Spinoza and his fellow Marano skeptic provoked recurrent interest, especially, again, in the 19th and 20th centuries, among playwrights, authors, composers, and artists of Jewish and non-Jewish origin. There was one author who I will mention, Karl Gutzkow, was a leader of the Young Germans, and he contributed markedly to the interest in de Costa through a work that he wrote in 1834 called The Sadducee of Amsterdam, which was translated into several languages, including Hebrew and Yiddish, without censoring its harsh portrayal of Jewish life, and widely read and performed in its theatrical rendition. Gutzkow hailed the battle, and the fact that it was translated into Hebrew and Yiddish, as you can imagine, showed that there were Jews who were impressed and wanted to hear about the Costa, and maybe also they felt a clear sense of identification with him. Gutzkow hailed the battle the Costa fought against fundamental Christianity and fundamental Judaism, uninvitingly depicted rabbinic authority and wealthy Jews, but he praised the beauty of Jewish women, and he was not the first to do so. And I would mention a work that was published in England in the 17th century with the same notion. And this notion of la belle juive is something which is being considered by different scholars. In Gutzkow's novella, de Costa the rationalist, who you see in front of you here, was pitted against religious obscurantism. But his suicide was not associated with the humiliation by the rabbis, but it was attributed to the fact that the woman he adored had left him for another man. Gutzkow ended the drama with Spinoza's presence at de Costa's funeral, thus magnifying the mythic relationship between the two Marranos and creating a lineage of rational opposition to an unswerving rabbinical authority. Gutzkow's treatment of de Costa and Berthold Auerbach's Spinoza from 1837, motivated in part by a desire to glorify Spinoza as a personification of universalism, but also to reject Gutzkow's critique of Jewish life, were two of the many creative interpretations of both figures that inspired others to inquire into their biographies and philosophical approaches. Imaginative constructions by artists of Jewish origin, in particular from Amsterdam and Eastern Europe, were part of this preoccupation. Now, let's begin. We have a lot of work to do today. Moritz Leon of Amsterdam, a young artist, little known, born in 1835, died in 1865. He depicted the trial of Spinoza. I'm just bringing you two images to get you into the spirit of things. The trial of Spinoza. Spinoza is seen standing and presenting his arguments, while various men of different religions, in particular rabbis and Calvinist clergymen, he's putting them together, gaze at Spinoza with a certain distrust. Now, on the wall, one can detect a glimpse of the Ten Commandments, which Spinoza did not see as God's law, but part and parcel of natural law. Leon collapsed, and remember what I said at the beginning, that there's one moment, in other words, there are different moments are taken together by the artist in one painting. So Leon has collapsed different moments of Spinoza's life into one scene. The excommunication on the one hand, and the Calvinist denunciation on the other. Indeed, two rabbis of note, Charles Levi Mortera, his former teacher, and Isaac Abuav de Fonseca, took part in the excommunication by the Mahamad in 1656. One of the rabbis seems to be questioning Spinoza on his interpretation of a passage in the open text he points to. However, the rabbi seated in the painting and pointing to the text though he bears some resemblance to Fonseca. It's not clear whether this indeed was meant to be Fonseca. Leon also placed the Calvinists together with the rabbis, emphasizing that Spinoza was also strongly denounced by the Calvinist establishment for his rejection of their basic tenets. One can assume from the little that is known of Moritz Leon's life that even as he was beginning a greater sense of involvement with Jewish ritual practice, his sympathies were certainly with Spinoza and not with the rabbinical figures. Now let's take a look at this. Again, unfortunately, paintings that have been lost. Here we see Uriel de Costa in a painting by Meyer de Haan. The plight of de Costa at the hands of the rabbis engaged as well certain artists. In this case, a Dutch artist of Jewish origin, Meyer Jacob de Haan, born in 1852 and died in 1895. De Haan stemmed from a well-to-do Orthodox Ashkenazic family in Amsterdam, but he gradually left the traditional milieu to the great chagrin of his father, a successful matzah and bread manufacturer. De Haan's interest in de Costa sharpens our perspective on how certain historical figures can emerge as significant carriers of message to later generations and individuals. In this particular case, it's almost as if the native son, de Haan, found a historical paradigm of his own troubled predicament. Both lived in Amsterdam. Both struggled with the strict rabbinical Jewish authorities, and both could not in the end submit totally to their demands. These internal associations and vicissitudes provide a background to the fact that the final version of the painting did not come easily to the artist. He seemingly worked on it for 8 years, from 1880 to 1888, illustrating his preoccupation with the implications of the subject matter. The painting leaves no room for doubt as to where de Haan's sympathies lie. Uriel stands alone in the center of the canvas, crestfallen, dejected, while facing him a group of elderly Orthodox Jews follow the deliberations eagerly. Their attention is directed to the left corner of the table, where a figure possibly intended to symbolize the head of the community or chief rabbinical authority seems to be in the midst of questioning de Costa. He, like most of the other Orthodox Jews in the painting, are portrayed with stereotypical, unpleasant features commonly seen in anti-Semitic depictions of Jews. De Haan had clearly no love for these figures, and his work sometimes, in another work which I won't show you today, created a great deal of consternation among Orthodox circles, though they were not many, in Amsterdam, when his works were seen, reviving the unsettling memory of de Costa's trial, his excommunication, and tragic ending, troubling a community that already depleted to a small minority of Dutch Jews. Uriel de Costa was de Haan's swan song from Amsterdam and his preoccupation with Jewish themes. He left for Paris in 1888 and later to Le Pouldu, where he became closely associated with Paul Gauguin. He wrote to Van Gogh in 1890, "Whenever I think on the oppressed and melancholy surroundings in which I shuffled around in that sober and narrow-minded art circle of my youth, then I feel enjoyed by my liberal ideas and feel a robust day coming and a great trust in the future." Now, let me turn to a person who you've heard again and again in the 2 previous lectures, but have never really concentrated on this wonderful artist. Mordechai Gottlieb, the distinguished 19th century Galician Jewish artist from Drahovich. He has left behind two moving paintings of da Costa, describing two significant moments in his life, both clearly inspired by the Polish translation of Gutzkow's book and the artist's own inner identity struggle. In this context, I will relate to one of his works. But first of all, you have to look at, again, see Jews praying in the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and just take a look at this child on the left, because we're going to see him in his Grisaille painting of Uriel da Costa in the synagogue from 1877. Da Costa is seen renouncing his beliefs in the synagogue, seemingly the only work in the series of illustrations planned for the Gutzkow edition that he was able to complete. Reconstructing a dramatic moment in da Costa's life, the painting places the philosopher barefoot on the bima, pounding his chest with his right hand in typical penitential style, as he reads out his reconciliation with traditional Jewish precepts, a step he believed would redress the community's grievances. Gottlieb strongly identified with the protagonist. He may even have hinted imaginatively at his own presence at the declaration by inserting to the side of the staircase the presence of a young child in a dreamlike gaze, wearing a long colored tunic, holding an open prayer book. The figure, of course, shares affinity with the child that we saw previously in his famous Yom Kippur painting, and universally considered to be Gottlieb as a young boy. So da Costa in the synagogue was well received in Lvov, where it was first exhibited, now, of course, known as Lviv. And after Gottlieb's death in 1879, his work was lauded by many, including, among others, Martin Buber. And I just want you to see this construction of how Gottlieb brings together in this painting of da Costa some other figures and possibly their influences on the way he created this image. Now, of course, Gottlieb was very close to feeling this sense of attachment to da Costa, and these were figures that he wanted to portray in different ways. Now, Hirschenberg, who I discussed last week, has done something else which you will recall was very important. Da Costa, Hirschenberg brought together both da Costa and Spinoza. For those of you who didn't see these images before, I'll be very brief because I don't want to return to something which I talked about last week. You see here da Costa sitting with Spinoza. The colored image is not, we have no idea whether the painting had those colors. It was done by somebody later on at some point. The painting was lost. And so what we do have is postcards from the image on the left. I just want you to put this together with the fact that we are concerned with this same figure, and I showed those of you who were with me last week, who you saw this very strong painting, which I commented upon, and maybe for those of you who were not with us last week, I'll just say one thing. This painting Hirschenberg does at the end of his life, in 1907, before he comes to Palestine. We see here 9 Orthodox Jews, unattractively portrayed, huddled together, gesticulating their apprehension and derision of Spinoza. They try to distance themselves from him as if they are feared fearing to be contaminated by him. And one of them bends down, as you see, to pick up a stone, apparently to heave it at the heretic. The 10th Orthodox Jew, seemingly younger than the other 9, is separated compositionally from the other 9 as he stares intently at the ambulant Spinoza and appears to be in a defensive motion. He is dressed somewhat differently from them. He's at a distance, and one imagines that Spinoza has cast a provocator's spell on him. He is, I would think, and I would say this, he is betwixt and between, trying to figure out with whom he could cast his lot, to become the 10th man or to join the skeptic. Spinoza seems to have no fear, and his central presence and function in the painting point unequivocally to Hirschenberg's identification with the world of enlightenment he represents. So when we think of the attraction that Gottlieb had, that Hirschenberg had, that Leon had, let us hear what Martin Buber writes in 1905 about Spinoza. A passive hero who was also attracted and thought passively to Spinoza, who possessed enough natura naturans to step from the ghetto into the cosmos actively and peacefully, and to take hold in the infinite as no one else before him. He compares him for a moment, a special role in the national regeneration of the Jews, not unlike Yehuda Halevi, if you will, precursors of Zionism. He compares Spinoza to a Talmudic Jew. And in that sense, he goes on to say, but how much of the most delicious temporality did he have to sacrifice? What barely intimated mystery of an incredible separateness did this liberated Talmudic Jew leave for posterity? The new Jew, now take note of this, the new Jew, the Jew of the emancipation, strolls in the paths of Spinoza, without genius, but with a demonic daring. And you can see how this impacted upon those who were around him. There was this demonic daring in Spinoza. The new Jew, the Jew of the emancipation, strolls in the paths of Spinoza without genius, but with a demonic daring. He was no longer passive, but acting freely. He no longer acted according to the law, in other words, according to Jewish tradition, but according to his own thought and feeling. Buber was not alone in this iconization of Spinoza, but for our purposes, he sheds light on the continuing reappropriation of Spinoza for Jewish historical and cultural agendas from the first half of the 19th century. And it seems to me appropriate today to bring to you what Joseph Klausner wrote, annulling the ban against Spinoza on February the 21st, 1927 at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem on Mount Scopus. This is what he wrote. To Spinoza the Jew, it is declared 250 years after his death, from the heights of Mount Scopus, from our temple in miniature, Migdash Me'at, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the ban is nullified. The sin of Jerusalem, the sin of Judaism against you is removed, and your offense against her atoned for. Our brother are you. Our brother are you. Our brother are you. Achimata, achinuata, achinuata, achinuata. Now, this is quite remarkable, but I want to show you something else. I want to show you what Mark Antokolsky, who was born in 1840 and died in 1902, did with Spinoza. And Antokolsky, the Russian Jewish sculptor, vacillated between his own identification with Russian realism and engagement with Jewish themes. Through the influence of the former, he was clearly predominant and penetrated his minimal Jewish works. This was especially true in the ways Antokolsky perceived the involvement of Russian realists with internal Russian conflicts and their appreciation of the struggle and martyrdom for one's conversions. His issues as a Jew were marked by this vantage point. And of course, once again, the Marano Jews become important. And Antokolsky relates to friends of mankind, which included Christ, Moses, Socrates, and Spinoza. Each of these figures intrigued Antokolsky, as he regarded each of them as unique individuals who rose above the ordinary person and remained steadfast in their beliefs and vision for humankind. One historian, Glantz, has described in detail how Antokolsky struggled for years with the powerful image of Spinoza and had a profound identification with him. "Oh, Spinoza, you are the one to be both admired and envied of. If I could, I would share my soul with yours." And so Antokolsky traveled to Amsterdam to get a more intimate feeling of the surrounding in which the great philosopher lived, collected various portraits of him, and made several sketches before creating the sculpture that you see here in the mid-1880s. He is seen seated, somewhat sloping in the armchair, his head slightly tilted. Spinoza appears to be in an almost frozen gaze, his hands folded together, and pages of a manuscript are on his lap, and an open book lies on the ground as if it fell unknowingly. Pensive and tired, Spinoza does not convey a sense of contentment. Antokolsky seems to express the long struggles Spinoza endured while remaining attached and committed to his thoughts and manuscripts. Though no authentic portrait of Spinoza exists, Antokolsky worked from some of the more common available images of the philosopher, showing him clean-shaven with long curly hair. Antokolsky regarded the sculpture as one in which he gave expression to his inner Jewish feelings, similar to the way in which he viewed his interpretations of Jesus. Spinoza joined Jesus and Socrates as representatives of individuals in conflict with history. Now, Reuben Breinen wrote when he saw this sculpture, and this is a long quote, but I do feel it's important for you to hear it. He dedicated special attention to Spinoza. He read it in almost mystical bind between the Hebrew philosophical head and the Hebrew creative sculpture, Antokolsky, dwelling on the profound connection between Antokolsky and the philosopher, saying between the creator and the creation that brings them close to each other and to a national and spiritual bond. Indeed, for Reuven Breiner, the Hebrew and Yiddish writer, he assumed that the sculpture could only have emerged from someone who truly loved and identified deeply with Spinoza, and then continued to he was also concerned with the appreciation by non-Jews of these two soulmates, noting that Spinoza, unlike the ways of non-Jews, possibly, was not stirred by material concerns, as he was above them, and sufficed with what he earned to be independent and devote his life solely to intellectual pursuits. And Breinen claimed to distinguish in Spinoza's facial appearance humane characteristics like humility, graciousness of spirit, integrity, and simplicity. That is the essence of beauty. Wisdom brightens up his face with a special light. So here you hear an interpretation of what Antokolsky's sculpture did for somebody when it was exhibited in 1896 in the Berlin Industrial Exhibition. And it was later appeared in the Hebrew newspaper Hamagid, and it's clear that Brenin wanted to give both to Antokolsky and Spinoza a national bent, even though this was not part of Antokolsky's life. Now, in this next work, which I want to show you, of Spinoza, of Christ before the People's Court, you can see that Antokolsky was clearly concerned with creating the interrelationship between the figures that I mentioned before, Christ, Moses, Socrates. These are friends of mankind, and here we see a very deep, penetrating appreciation of Antokolsky in this work. But I want to turn for a moment to another figure, very briefly, a very distinguished German artist of Jewish origin, Max Liebermann. Now, Liebermann, at a young period in his life, creates an image of 12-year-old Jesus in the temple from 1879. Now, we see here a version which created a tremendous stir. People condemned Liebermann for making this image of Christ. And it had a tremendous impact upon his life, and he then made some revisions. You see here that previously the way Jesus is standing in the temple, and notice the figures around him. It's as if it's taking place in a synagogue in Amsterdam. Not all the figures are traditional, but it's clear that this image which Liebermann created disturbed people. There was a tremendous controversy about it. It was brewing in Germany just after it was created, and it pushed Liebermann to avoid doing anything in this context in the next years. And I think that we should keep this in mind as we're going to see how this figure, looking at Jesus, the 12-year-old Jesus, how it will reappear in other works of art. But just keep this in mind, these two images, and then you're going to see, possibly, this is what helped Hirschenberg see. He probably saw the Liebermann version, took the 12-year-old Jesus, turned him into the young Spinoza, and then an artist whose name is probably not known to most of you, a Hungarian artist of Jewish origin by the name of Herzl, was born in 1853 and died in 1917, who created similar context to represent the philosopher's confrontation with the Ma'amad. And I'm going to be brief here because there's too much to say, in the sense that we have here the work of an artist whose work remains inaccessible or lost, unfortunately, but only appears in various Hungarian encyclopedias that deal with them. And it is, when you look at this Spinoza, this is Kovish in his studio, surrounded by various works which he did, and then you have this image of Kovish. Spinoza before the rabbis. Again, once, unfortunately, the painting is lost. It was reproduced in a Hungarian journal in 1917, where we see Spinoza standing upright in the center of the canvas, clearly composed and collected as three seated bearded figures, look at him uncomfortably and eye him. Look at him with some disdain. The artist's sympathy is clearly with Spinoza. His image is pure, young man in sharp relief to those of the rabbis. The rays of light from outside shine on Spinoza, an element that Curvish utilized. If you may remember back, you will see for a moment the way it appeared in his portrayal of Moses before Frederick the Great. And he may have appropriated this motive from his teacher, which I will come back to in a moment. But I want you to see, in a sense, what's happening here. We have here Spinoza before the rabbis. If you look closely, what I brought you from Lieberman's portrayal of Jesus before the rabbis, you can see that it was quite clear that Curvish knew of Lieberman's presentation, and the rabbinic figures who were sitting, or the main rabbinic figure with his hand to his chin, very similar to what we see in this image by Curvish of Spinoza. And then I have brought to you different versions, different elements, details from different paintings to show you how important this was in his creation. And of course, one other important element was his teacher, his Parisian teacher, Lorrain, who inserted Jean-Paul Lorrain, the agitator of Languedoc. Now, what is interesting here is what Jean-Paul Lorrain did was he went back to a 13th, to a figure who was tried by the Inquisition. And the friar Bernard de Lisieux argued his case before a tribunal of the Inquisition, much like what Spinoza is doing in the 17th century. De Lisieux was tortured for his tenacious battle and died in jail, and he became a symbol for anti-clericalists in France in the second half of the 19th century, following the publication of a certain book in 1877 on the friar and its subsequent controversy. Therefore, in identifying with the opponents of the French Catholic movement in the 19th century, Laurent made iconized the daring battle of this Franciscan friar. And it was during these years that Curvish was in Paris, a student of Laurent, and this enabled him to both breathe the air of anti-clerical France and to eventually draw a parallel between their historical hero and his. And so we can see here that Curvish turns to his version of Spinoza, bringing together Lieberman, bringing together Laurent, and therefore the notion of this, and when you see the ray of light on de Lisieux, you saw it also on Mendelssohn, and you saw it also on Spinoza. And therefore, coming back to the beginning of where we began, you can see that there is something similar in Moritz Leon's The Trial of Spinoza and Curvich's Spinoza before the rabbis, but it's clearly influenced by other figures from other artists from the 19th century. Now, Curvish was certainly very engaged with Spinoza. This is another image that he did of him, and I would just conclude briefly by reminding those of you who saw what I showed you 2 weeks ago when I showed you Wiesen. I brought you these images showing Spinoza among other distinguished men of Israel. But I want to conclude my discussion of Spinoza to leave some time to talk about Herzl by going to something very different, which some of you may have seen by the pop artist, a man who is considered to be the grandfather or the father of pop art in America, who of course comes from Eastern European Jewish sources, born at the beginning of the 20th century, died over 20 years ago, and this is his history of matzah. And I'm only bringing you part 2 of this very interesting, what should we say, attempt to bring the history of the Jews in various versions. Now, if you look closely at the center, you will see, of course, something which you have seen before, and that is he's brought in Gottlieb's depiction of the ceremony of the synagogue on the Eve of Atonement. You will see, of course, Herzl and Zionism to the right, or to my right, in that famous way in which Herzl is looking on. And you'll see some other things which I won't go into now. You'll see something of the Fettmilch riots from 1612, which are in the background. Now look and see if you can find Spinoza. And indeed, you can see Spinoza sort of coming from behind a rabbinic figure, not a very attractive-looking rabbinic figure, some say in some possible relationship to Larry Rivers. You see Spinoza appearing. So, in trying to assemble the history of the past, bringing together a potpourri of elements, and here Rivers feels very, is not concerned, as is Avichai, to make sure that I have everything well documented and I have insurance that these paintings are we're given courtesy to use them. Larry Rivers has no concern with this. So he brings together Gottlieb, he brings together Fettmilch, he brings together this rabbi over a certain Polish synagogue, and in the background is Spinoza. Now, I have a few minutes left, and I will shockingly begin with this. Now, shockingly, because if you haven't seen this, you will be somewhat surprised to see who is expelling Adam and Eve from the Garden of Evil, from the Garden of Eden in 1908. Now, Ephraim Moses Lillian was asked to join a interreligious group which wanted to publish both the Old and New Testament. Now, Lillian, at that point, is still very much identified with Zionism. He doesn't remain, he comes to Palestine for several years, gradually leaves, but he is clearly captured by the image of Theodor Herzl. And because Lillian was also very much under the influence of the certain movement in art at the end of the 19th century and a certain attraction to eroticism, we see here Herzl holding a sword which covers his personal parts. He is looking very strongly at these two figures who he's expelling from the Garden of Evil. And in this Bible, which was published in Germany in 1908, we have these remarkable images which Lillian produced, which formulates the Herzl as an icon of culture, and an icon that reappears in different directions. Now here you see the same Lillian bringing Herzl into the context of Moses on the descent from Mount Sinai, about to break the tablets. In other words, as he is trying to interpret for this volume the narratively, this in a narrative sense, but also in a very visual sense, he is trying to think, how can I interpret Moses better? Really, I have to use a figure who has the power of Moses. And the power of Moses for Lillian at that time is Theodor Herzl. And if he is here in one way, we can see him here in another way, holding the tablets in this very mix of traditions and creating this figure of Moses in a very dressed in this particular form. And then we can even see Lillian doing something else. Those of you who know the Bible will, of course, know the scene that I'm showing you here. When you see the scene of Balaam, and you see the encounter with the angel, when the donkey is sort of frightened because the donkey is aware of the angel, and Lillian presents the angel, the forceful figure of Herzl, of the angel, or Herzl with the sword standing, as opposed to Bilam, to the donkey. In a sense, you could say that Lillian is imagining what one could perceive that is happening in the book of Numbers, Balak and Bilam in this particular situation, the donkey, and the angel stands strongly, and that angel is Theodor Herzl. Now, if this is not enough, you could go in so many different directions to see the way Herzl is being iconized. After his death, though already before he died in 1904, he's all over the place. And this is the work, a memorial plaque which Boris Schatz created in 1906 with the saying, if you will, Im Tirtzu Ein Zu Agada, if you will, there is no Im Tirtzu Ein Zu Agada. It's not simply a it is possible. If you will it, it is possible. And then he has the figure of Moses. That is, you can see that Schatz is also doing the same thing. We have Herzl in the center of this memorial plaque. We have the figure of Moses, and therefore you are creating or identifying Herzl with Moses, and quoting from Herzl's work, but of course Herzl never wrote in Hebrew. And I'm coming back to the carpet which became so common, this image which was created of Herzl leaning on a balcony, and people entering, coming up to Jerusalem. In the background, you have you can see the sun rising and so on and so forth, and it's as if Herzl is standing there, looking at the vision that is appearing, people coming to the country, the sun bright and shining, the Star of David atop them, and thus there is endless ways in which one can see the interpretation of Herzl as this historic figure in this carpet which was made for David Wolfson. And if you look at this triptych, on the one hand you see on one side someone blowing a shofar, on the other side the notion that somebody who was maybe in thorns is coming alive, but in the center you can see Herzl dressed again in this traditional, in this pre-Christian form, standing next to this bride, somebody holding a canopy, and the quotations around speaking about returning to Palestine, and thus I would say we can see that people who wanted to have an image of Herzl in their home could turn to many different possibilities. They could turn to a micrography, letters, words from his Altneuland, which are creating this form of Herzl. And in that sense, I would say that Herzl brings us something, brings us to a very different sense than the interpretation that we saw of someone who was opposed to the rabbinic authorities. Herzl is appearing here in many different ways, both in the Bible, in Lillian's interpretation, and in other forms of seeing him creating or bringing people up to Palestine. And I would like to conclude with two general remarks. What I've shown you here over these 4 lectures is an attempt to bring you to the awareness of how the visual has become so important and so central to create different ideologies within Judaism. And therefore, seeing someone like Mendelssohn, seeing someone like Spinoza, seeing someone like Herzl, you're seeing 3 very different worlds. And therefore, these different worlds have found interpretations by a large number of artists of Jewish origin. And I hope that in the future, when you look at visual material, you will think of the way that they were created and why they were created and what purposes they were serving for those who created them and for those who fostered them and tried to bring them to a wider group of the public. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing your comments in one form or another. Have a good evening.